Hello. I think we're going. I see someone is watching. Hopefully that's not just me. Nice to meet everybody. This is my second or third now attempt at knitting on Twitch. I think I've got the setup the way I want. So it's Sunday night here. I'm in Munich, Germany. It's Sunday night, about 9 o'clock. I've had dinner, had a glass of wine, and I'm just going to knit for a bit before I go to bed. Seemed like a good idea. So I'm working on a sweater for myself. This pattern is called Lanatus. It's by a designer called Susan Crawford. So Susan has just published a book of knitting patterns called Evolution. And so I saw a mention on Twitter a couple months back about the book. Susan was actually having trouble advertising the book because it was called Evolution. And she was having her ads rejected, interestingly enough. And so, of course, I had to support her by ordering the book. And she did something really cool where she, if you bought the book, you would get the PDF of the patterns while the book was still being printed. So I just saw today on her Twitter that the book has been printed, and so my copy has been sent. So I'm just waiting for that to arrive, and I'm actually planning on gifting the book to a friend. But in the meantime, she sent out the PDF, which was really cool because you could start knitting from the patterns. I think there's about a dozen patterns in there or so. And this one I just fell in love with immediately. So Lanatus is a sweater. I'm making it for myself, a jumper, as we might say in Australia. And it's a Fair Isle jumper. So for those of you who don't know, this is Fair Isle. Fair Isle is a technique where you never have more than two colors in the same row. So it's what you probably think of as traditional ski jumpers, a lot of them. This is a Fair Isle design. I think actually the book, the concept of the book with Evolution is these are all based on sort of Shetland and very traditional pattern designs that she's then sort of updated to be a little bit more of a modern style. And so this jumper is knit top down. So you actually start from the collar and knit downwards. So you see I cast on for the collar there. And then after you do the collar, you actually, because it's not completely symmetrical, the back side of the sweater actually has a slightly higher neck. If you look at store-bought ones, you can see that as well. And so what you do is you use a technique called short row, which actually you can tell here the distance between the collar and the motif is greater on the back side. The collar is a little higher on the back. Using short rows. And so then once I started going round and round, each of the motifs, you knit each of the motifs with the two colors, and then there are 3 rows between each motif. So the first round is just plain, then the middle round or middle row is where the increases happen. That's where you're adding stitches, and that's what gives you the shaping as it goes from the neck down over the shoulders. It's got to get bigger. So that's what creates the shaping, is the increase rows between each of the motifs. And so you knit and knit and knit, and you keep increasing until you get basically to the bottom of the armpits, to the bottom of the where the arms are. And you'll see here I actually have divided for the arms. So you can see here an armhole with an armpit. And so I think I had about 600 stitches on the needle by the time I got to that point. Like, that's a lot of knitting. Oh, hey, Margaret's back. It's nice to see you, Margaret. She was on this first stream I tried this morning where I forgot to click the button to record it and save it. So this one will actually be saved for posterity. The first one, Margaret, you're lucky. You were there. You can say you were there then. Not everybody else missed out on it. So 600 stitches or so. You divide for the armholes. As you can see, I've put the arm stitches on some waste wool. So they're actually still live, and I've just used this extra of the white wool here to thread them on. And I tried it on for fit, and it does fit. And so now she did give you a couple options. You could do a version of this that was patterned the entire thing, but I kind of liked the idea of just having the pattern on the top on the yoke. So I'm following that design option, and I'm now on the portion where I'm just knitting away throughout the body. So yeah, I'm just doing plain knitting. So for those of you who have learned to knit, there are really only 2 stitches, knit and purl, and you just combine them in lots of different ways. And so if you're knitting a scarf, back and forth rectangular object, and you knit all the stitches on one side and then you purl all the stitches on the other, you get what's called stocking stitch or stockinette stitch. And this is what you normally see in commercially made sweaters and jumpers. If you look at the jumper I'm wearing, for example, this sleeve here, this is stockinette stitch. You see it's rather smooth on the outside. You get sort of like little V's, and then on the inside, it's all bumpy. That's stockinette stitch. That's characteristic of stockinette stitch. Now, what I'm doing is I'm actually knitting this garment in the round, as we say, or knitting it using a circular needle. As you can see, my needles are actually joined by a cable. So I'm actually going around and around and around in a spiral. And so when you do that, the cool thing is all you have to do is knit, and you get stockinette stitch automatically. I don't have to do any purling. So you can see the inside is the purl side. That's the wrong side, as we say. That's the inside of the garment. The outside, where I'm doing knitting, 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 is the stockinette stitch part. So pretty cool. So I'm just going around and around and around and knitting. This is a fairly fine wool that I'm using. I'm using Lana Grossa Cool Wool Fine, it's called. It is a 100% merino. It's actually got the Australian wool mark on it, so I'm guessing it's Australian merino. It's very soft, and quite thin, as you can see. We talk about the ply or thickness of yarn, knitters do, and it basically means how thick your garment is going to end up. And so this is quite fine, which means this garment is going to be fairly, thinner and more delicate. That's both a stylistic choice, like I like that you get more layering out of a garment like that, but also given that Fair Isle portion here in the yoke, you basically end up with double thickness whenever you're doing that kind of a design. And in fact, if I look on the inside, you can see because you're sort of stranding, it's also called stranded knitting, you're stranding the colors along behind each other. When a color isn't being used, it's sort of being carried along the back side. You end up with a fabric that's actually twice as thick. And so if you were to do that kind of a design in a very thick wool, it would make for a very thick and very warm jumper. So you often find that Fair Isle or stranded knitting is done with thinner yarn as opposed to something very thick. So that's why I'm doing this thinner stuff. It's often also done with fairly, I'll be honest with you, scratchy and like sticky yarn, yarn that sort of will kind of almost felt together. That would be the traditional style of like the Shetland yarn that you would use. This is 100% wool. You can see it's actually fairly smooth. It's not itchy in the slightest. So I'm really looking forward to wearing this. The pattern also does have long sleeves. I'm planning on doing just the short sleeve version and wearing it over a long sleeve shirt if I need to for extra warmth. So yeah, the thickness of the yarn determines the thickness of the garment. It also, to some extent, determines the needle size that you use because, as you can see, I'm using fairly small needles. These are 3 millimeter. I have here a knitting needle gauge, if you've never seen one before. This is a knitting needle gauge that you can use if for some reason you don't know which size you're using. You actually just find the smallest size hole that it goes in, and that tells you what size it is. As you can see on here, in addition to the metric sizing, there's also 2 other different sizing schemas on here. One is the American one and one is the British. It's really fun. They go in opposite directions. So if you're following a knitting pattern, it is sometimes very important to know where it was published, or you will get the wrong size needles. That's why the metric, as with most things, metric is a hell of a lot easier. So these are 3mm needles I'm using. And pro tip, when you buy a ball of wool, it will usually tell you a recommended needle size. You see this one here actually has their 2.5 to 3. So I'm using a 3. I actually started off using the 2.5 on the collar. And so one of the features of this pattern is you actually increase the needle size as you go along. And that also helps with the shaping, because as you knitting with a bigger needle, the sort of spaces between the stitches get larger and you end up with a looser garment. And so you're actually going to increase, I'm actually going to do one last needle size increase towards the bottom, which will give even a little bit more shaping down near the waist. And so with the circular needle, these are wooden needles, you might notice. Oh, a few more people have joined. Hi, new people who've joined. So these needles are made by a company called Knit Pro, and they're probably my favorite needles, to be honest with you. Wooden needles are a bit nicer on your hands if you have any sort of arthritis or hand pain. A metal needle can be quite, they don't flex at all. They also can be quite cold if you're in a cold climate, like I happen to be. Versus the wooden ones aren't like that. You also get plastic or casein, which is a sort of plastic-like material made from milk protein. Bamboo is a very popular choice. I believe, I'm not sure what actual wood the Knit Pros are made out of. They stain them this sort of cool rainbow kind of colors. You also get different levels of pointiness. Oh, hi, the Ruiner 78. Nice to see you. Yeah, you can decide how pointy you like the needles. I prefer a fairly pointy needle. It often will come down to the wool you're knitting. So for example, if you're knitting a wool that's very fuzzy or that splits very easily, in that case, I actually do prefer a blunter knitting needle, because you have less chance that you're going to split the wool as you're putting the needle into the stitch. Also, sometimes a wool will be too slippery with the needle, and you'll set it down and all the stitches will just slide off the needle. So again, sometimes you want a slightly stickier feel. So you kind of have to match the needle to the project. The cool thing now is circular. I mean, I love circulars. Once you go circular, you will never go back. I will never again buy a pair of straight knitting needles in my life, because they're pointless. You can knit rectangular things back and forth with these. You just, when you get to the end of the row, turn it round and change hands and go the other way. It's absolutely fine. Or you can knit tubes, as I'm doing, going round and round and round. It's great on airplanes or in the car, because you don't have these long sticks sticking out. You've just got this little thing that sits nicely on your lap. Yeah, they're just, circulars are the best. And honestly, if you've only ever knitted with straight stick knitting needles, these are way better. Also for knitting big things like baby blankets or even actual blankets, because you can get these like 1.5 meters long, and you can really cram, a lot of stitches on there. The weight of it is sitting in the middle of your lap. It's not hanging off this stick that you're holding in your hands. So go circular. If you've never tried circular needles, get them. They're great. You can also now, one of the coolest things in sort of the last 10, 20, actually they're older than that, but they've really made a lot of refinements, are the interchangeable circulars. So you can actually buy a kit that's got sort of, 10 or 20 different size needle tips, just this portion, just the tip, and then they either screw or click onto different lengths of cables. So if you're looking to shop for a knitter for Christmas, and they don't have a set of interchangeables, it's a great gift. It's so nice to not have to worry that you've got the needle size, because you can just, even if you've already got a project on the go, they usually come with like an end cap, so you can unclip, you can take the tips off and put on a sort of stopper and use the tips on another project. So I actually I've got some Addy Clicks. I've got a set of the Denise, which is a plastic one. They're not my favorite, but I use them in a pinch. There's a lot of different types of the interchangeable needles, so they're really cool. I like those a lot. Oop, I've dropped a stitch. Oh, good, I've made a mistake. Now I get to fix it. So a stitch has slid off the left-hand needle before I had a chance to knit it. And so if I didn't notice it, it would ladder down, like in a pair of pantyhose. So you can see I've just got it here on my on my right hand tip there. So that stitch slid off, and if I let it go, that loop would just unravel all the way to the bottom of the garment. And there are actually patterns where you deliberately do that as a design element. I've knitted a few that use that, and it looks really cool, but I don't want that in my sweater, definitely not. So the important thing, because I used to work in a knitting shop, and whenever someone would drop a stitch, they'd freak out and often pull their whole project apart because they didn't know how to fix it. It is easily fixable. So the important thing is to catch it immediately. So you saw, as soon as I realized I dropped it, I caught it with my needle. You can also use a safety pin or a paper clip or whatever you have handy. So just catch it so it doesn't unravel any further. Then what you have to do is work out how many rows it's fallen. So if I sort of pull forward, you can see I've got 2 strands behind it there. So that's how many loops down it's fallen. So I basically need to make 2 loops from that. So I'm actually going to put the stitch back on my left hand tip now. And I'm going to use that left tip to pick up the first of those 2 strands. So there it is. So the first thing on the needle is the stitch and the second is the strand. And I'm actually just going to lift the stitch over the strand and boom, I've made my first stitch. I've repaired the first stitch. So again, you can see I've got that stitch, that last stitch on the left-hand needle. Again, I've got 1 more strand to pick up, so I'm going to pick it up with my left-hand needle. So again, you can see there's the strand and then there's the stitch, and I'm going to use the tip of my right needle to just lift the stitch over the strand. There you go. We've fixed a dropped stitch. That's how you repair a dropped knit stitch. You do a slightly different way if you drop a purl stitch, which someday I will demonstrate for you. But I mean, it's not the end of the world. You just have to not stress and not pull your whole pattern apart. It's fixable. Worst case scenario, put a safety pin into the stitch so it doesn't drop any further, and go find an experienced knitter who will show you personally how to do it. You can do it using a crochet hook. That's an easy way to do it. And yeah, you can actually just fix that ladder, just doop, 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 all the way back up to the top. It gets a little trickier sometimes if you were knitting lace or cables. Sometimes you can fix those. Sometimes it gets a little hard to work out how to fix it. And so in that case, you use other techniques like a safety line, so that you can just pull back to a known, like a save point in a video game, you can pull back to a known good point. But yeah, it's hard to know how to repair errors unless you make them. So you've got to make some mistakes in order to know how to fix them. I wondered if this time zone would be better for people. It's early morning in Australia. It's evening in Europe, and it is mid-afternoon in America. So I thought maybe a few more folks would be able to join in. So if you are on, feel free to say hi in the chat or to tweet me. My Twitter is on the left there. It's web_goddess. Say hello. If you are a knitter and you want to look me up on Ravelry, it's web goddess without the underscore. So I'm over there as well. Oh, the ruiner. Oh, thanks. Oh, wish I could watch a bit more, but I got to get the kids up. Totally understandable. You must be in Australia. Hope it's not too hot. I heard that the change finally came through. So have a great start to your week. Thanks for joining in. They were writing that just as I was commenting on the time zone. Yep. Well, yeah, it's especially interesting. I work on a distributed team, and I've got team members in Seattle, in Australia, and in Europe. So we alternate whether Europe has to do the early morning or the late evening. Frankly, I prefer the evening. This time actually is better for me. I'm not a morning person. Oh, well, thanks. Oh, that's so nice of you. You could watch all day. Well, I'm planning on doing this look, I'm in Europe. We're under lockdown. It's not like I can go anywhere. So I'm kind of thinking on Sundays, maybe Sunday will be my knitting on Twitch day. I might do a bit in the morning and then a bit more in the evening. It's going to get me powering through, especially through this boring part of the sweater. I've got quite a bit of light. This is a darker colored yarn, and yeah, it's a lot of people. I've met a lot of beginners. Oh, great! I want to make a scarf in fine black or fuzzy black wool, and I have to just tell them, like, for your first project, get something you can actually see. Lighter colors are your friend. Like, I've got a lot of light shining on me right now, so you can see me, and even then, it's still not super easy for me to see what I'm doing. With just knitting, it's fine. I can honestly, I can almost kind of do it by feel. But I do find myself, especially now that we're in winter here, it gets darker in the evening. It's getting hard for me to see the stitches. I'm also getting older. But if you're starting out, I recommend a lighter wool, and in daylight will be your friend. Oh, yeah, Rona, I know, on lockdown. Well, I was in Sydney until 3 months ago. And yeah, I know full well what you all in Melbourne accomplished. So it's actually amazing. I saw like 30 days without any infections. Like, way to go, Victorians. You guys are amazing. Germany, look, we moved internationally to Germany from Australia in the middle of a pandemic. And Germany was doing pretty well comparatively in Europe. I mean, they still kind of are, but numbers are going up again. So we've been on lockdown light for the last month, and they have just extended us basically up till Christmas. So, we managed to do a tiny bit of travel when not long after we got here, but all the hotels and restaurants are closed now. Angela's telling everybody to just stay home. Oh, there, a tweet. Oh, Braun, it was Braun. Oh, cool. Hi, thanks, Braun. Have a good day. Have a great week. Yeah, so we came here to travel, and unfortunately right now that's kind of off the table, so I knit. I probably don't knit as much as people think I do. That's why I'm looking forward to Twitch as a way of forcing me to knit more regularly. Some really lovely knitting shops in Munich, actually. I bought this wool. I actually bought this wool at a knitting shop here in Munich called Artilea. I think that's how you say it. Artilea. Artilea. They're in the city center. Lovely little shop, packed full of beautiful wool. The woman at the counter on the day I visited, she did speak English. I was attempting to speak German, but she immediately, as everyone here does, picked up on my accent and responded to me in English. But yeah, there's another, the Mercerie, Die Mercerie, is another really lovely little knitting shop I've been to here in Munich. So there's several. I plan on, hopefully once there's a vaccine and we're able to go back to normal, I would love to, meet some of the local knitters, knitting groups at these shops. Maybe do a stitch and bitch or something like that. Actually, I need to find out if there's a guild here. I was a member of the Knitters Guild back in Australia. And I miss all my lovely guild friends. So it'd be cool to see if they have something similar here. So soon I'm going to have to count my number of rows, which, as I said, will be fun, given that I can barely see these stitches. But you would have seen I came across this green thing. So someone asked me this morning, how do I know when I get back to the beginning? This is the marker for the beginning. So this is what's called a stitch marker. And they come in lots of shapes and sizes. This is one that's actually, it's almost like a safety pin, like you can actually open it up so you can move it around. But the idea is it's sitting on the needle, between two stitches. And so every time I come to it, I just slip it from one needle to the other, and I know that that's the start of the round. I actually have here a little toolbox. This was a gift from my knitting club back in Australia. Miss them. Love you all. and I've got my stitch markers in it. So as you see, there's the little metal type that I'm using now. But there's also, these are fairly common, these sort of plastic padlock looking ones that again are removable. You can also get just washers. I've even seen people use just like washers from the hardware store. And you can also get really fancy ones. So again, pro tip, if you're buying something for knitters for Christmas, stitch markers are always nice. And if you go on Etsy or look on some of the nice knitting shops, you'll probably be able to find really nice custom ones. You know, people put little charms on them or cute little motifs. So yeah, and they're different colors because that's important. You might actually have many stitch markers around the course of a round. I knitted a very complicated cable jumper that had similar to what I'm wearing now. So this one has, you know, different motifs on it. And so let's say you've got cables. That's the one that kind of looks like ropes on it. So let's say I have a cable that's about 10 stitches wide, and then on either side of that, I've got 20 stitches of you know, honeycomb stitch or something. And so I could actually put stitch markers between to delineate each of those sections so I know which one I'm in. And that's where using different colors really comes in. So I like to use green at the start of the round, and then you can use other colors to delineate portions as you go. So it's nice. I've caught at least a couple of the Aussies. Wasn't sure how early you all get up, and it's all Monday morning there. You're all getting ready to go to work or work from home. Now, I should comment on my knitting action because it may be unusual to some of you, or it may look very common. I knit with the working wool. So the end that's attached to the ball of wool, that's what we call the working wool. That's always attached to your right hand needle, and I hold it in my right hand. As you can see, I kind of just loosely thread it through my fingers. And so when I knit, you know, it's a 4-step action. You put your needle into the needle, you go around the back, you pull the loop through, and then the left-hand stitch comes off. I do that with a sort of exaggerated throwing motion. You know, and I think when people learn, they tend to pick it up, and then they tend to grab it and pull it through. You know, the more you do it, the more use you get sort of the muscle memory of it. And so for me, it's a very quick, exaggerated throwing motion. Sometimes I even lift my right hand completely off the needle. And I'm kind of using my left hand pointer finger there. You see, when I put the needle through, I'm actually holding it in place fully with just that left hand. And so I then loop the working wool around and pull it through. I'm a tight knitter. I've worked hard to not try and be too tight. And by that I mean the tension, you know, like beginners often when they put the stitch through, they really pull it and they pull that working wool tight. And you don't want to do that because it's going to make a fabric that's really tight and doesn't stretch. And so you want to kind of get a nice mix between something that is a good tension where it's not too loose and floppy, but not overly tight and non-stretchy. Dropped another stitch, so I'll just catch that before it goes too far and fix it. So how far did this one drop? This one dropped 1, 2 again, just because I'm slippery wool and I'm looking up. And so occasionally they drop off. I'll just put that one on, and then that loop goes over, and I fixed it again. So there. Yeah, so tension we were talking about. So yeah, I'm a thrower, I guess, as you could call it. I believe it's also, this is British or American style, where you're holding the working wool on the right-hand side. I know it looks like I'm fast because I am practiced, but truthfully, the fastest knitters in the world knit continental style. And I can knit continental style. I'm not as fast with it, but continental, you actually hold the working wool in your left hand. So again, I kind of wind it loosely through my fingers. And the idea here is that it's a smaller motion. I put the needle through the stitch, and then I'm just going to kind of like catch it with the tip and pull the loop through and off. So it's a much smoother motion, you can see. Other people are even better at it than I am. I'm still not super practiced with it, but it's a much smaller motion. And because of that, it's easier on your hands if you have arthritis or something like that. You know, my motion with the throwing is going to result in carpal tunnel or you know, repetitive injuries, versus the continental style is much gentler on you. But look, I honestly feel like the way that you're taught, you're kind of to some extent stuck with. You can try and cultivate the other way. I mean, the interesting thing about the continental style with it in the left hand is, as I understand it, in the olden days, when they were using straight needles, you would have a very long left-hand needle, like we're talking really long, and a special belt that the end of the needle would go into that kind of held it in place. So imagine I've got this long needle kind of sticking out here. Imagine that's my hand. And so actually my hands would be completely free. They wouldn't need to hold the left-hand needle. And so you would be even faster then at doing this continental left-hand style, because this left-hand needle, I wouldn't have to hold it. I wouldn't have to support it. So yeah, I believe the fastest knitters in the world all knit continental style. But as you can see, it's not supernatural to me. I try and learn to do it, because I mix it up every now and then. It's good to change your motion up just so you don't, you know, strain yourself doing the same motion a bazillion times. But also when I did the two color part, so the top of this jumper where it has the two color section, I actually knitted that with one color in each hand. So I held the teal, the background color, in my right hand always, and I held the white in the left hand and knitted it continental style. So if, let's say I needed to do 3 teals and 2 whites, I would do 3 throws with my right hand side with the teal, and then I would actually knit continental style using the left hand for the white stitches. And you really want to sort of keep, I think if you're going to do that, and it's much faster than sort of dropping the wool and picking it up every single time. It's a much faster way to do it. You just have to be consistent with which color is in which hand, because it actually can affect the way the motif looks. And I've seen examples where someone would knit a sample like this, and just by changing which color, the dominant color or the background color, which hand it's in, you actually can tell it makes a difference to the way it looks, because one of them tends to, you know, sort of sit in front a little bit. So yeah, my tip for knitting stranded is just to make sure if you're doing 2 color Fair Isle, you always be consistent about which color goes in which hand. And I like to put the background in the right hand, because you end up doing more of it, and I'm more confident with the throwing style. I think also lefties, left-handed people. If you're a left-hander, you should try and learn continental. I think you will be happy if you do. It's just, I learned the way I learned. And I didn't learn as a child, I should say. People probably assume that people who are good at knitting have been doing it since they were 3. I learned to knit when I was 24, probably? 25? It was after I moved to Australia. I moved to Australia, and I was waiting to get a work visa, and so I did some cross stitch, which I'd done as a kid, and that's all right. I'm not a huge cross stitch fan. It's cute. I like it, but you know, it's basically a paint by numbers. I made a couple quilts, patchwork quilts, using cut up, you know, shirts from the op shop. That's or Goodwill, as Americans would call it. And then I thought, all right, I'll learn to knit. You know, how hard can it be? Never learned to do it. You know, my mom crocheted a bit, but she never knitted. I never saw anyone knitting as a child that I can remember. And so my Australian mother-in-law sent me a ball of wool, an 8-ply ball of wool, normal red wool, and a pair of 4mm knitting needles, plastic needles, and a kids learn to knit book. It was called Fun with Wool. I believe it was put out by Peyton's in Australia, possibly. And yeah, it was a Kids Learn to Knit book. And I sat down and thought, all right, I'll knit this pot holder. And I think I tore the damn thing apart about 10 times. Just a simple pot holder, a combination of knits and purls. Yeah, it's not as easy as it looks. And so I eventually got my pot holder. I sorted that out and then moved on to sweaters and scarves. Oh, this was about the time the Harry Potter movies were coming out, you know, the early Harry Potter movies. And I really liked the scarves, the house scarves that they had. And so I wanted to make myself a Gryffindor scarf. And so I ended up knitting several Hogwarts-style scarves for people, for friends, for my sister, in different colors. So I did them, that's where I learned to knit in the round, because I discovered pretty quickly that doing them as a circular tube like this and then flattening them meant that they didn't have a wrong side. Because stockinette stitch, as we said, you know, it's smooth on one side but bumpy on the other, means that your scarf isn't the same on both sides if you try and knit stockinette. And also, if you've ever tried to knit a scarf in stockinette stitch, it always wants to curl up into a tube. It won't lie flat for you. And I wanted a nice sort of rugby scarf that laid flat with different stripes. And I hit upon this idea of knitting it as a tube and then just squashing it. So I used a 40 centimeter circular needle. So this is a 60. I like the 60s best, but they come in different lengths. So I used a 40 centimeter circular, and I just knitted these 6 foot long, 8-inch wide Gryffindor scarves. And each one probably took me 15 to 20 hours of knitting. And you get a lot of muscle memory. So the throwing motion is very ingrained in me, in my knitting action. And then, of course, they changed the design of them in the third movie, so I had to knit some more using the new design. But when you start out, I know a lot of beginners, they get upset because their knitting doesn't look, look, this has come straight off the needles and it's fairly smooth and even. Once I give it a wash and lay it flat to dry, it'll look even better. We call that blocking. But a lot of people, their tension, especially when they're new to knitting, it doesn't look as nice on the needle. Some stitches are tighter than others and some are looser, or you may find yourself having to really jam and push the stitches along because you've pulled the wool so tight. It just comes with practice. And I think those Harry Potter scarves were what gave me nice even tension. You just knitting, doing this motion thousands and thousands and thousands of times. You get a little bit more even and consistent with it. So you just got to practice. There's still a few people watching. I do have tight tension though. I mean, it's even, but I think if you looked at the continuum of it, I still am more on the tight end of the spectrum. So we talk about knitters having a tension. And as I say, some of it is a factor of your experience with knitting. Beginners tend to be tight. But then amongst experienced knitters, you find people who knit very loosely and some like me who knit a little tighter. And the interesting thing is that does affect garment size. So you can imagine if you're pulling the wool that much tighter and the garment is that much less stretchy and tight together, it's not going to be as big. And so a pattern will specify what we call a gauge. So how many stitches and how many rows over 10 centimeters. And so what you're supposed to do with a given wool and needles is actually knit a test swatch. So knit like a 4-inch square, a 10 centimeter square tension swatch, we call it, or a gauge swatch. You're supposed to wash it, hang it up to dry, do all this, and then measure it to see. Look, to be honest with you, most experienced knitters, we kind of cheat on that part. I don't bother anymore. I kind of just know that my tension is a little bit tighter than the needle size. So the way you adjust for tension is by adjusting the size needle that you use. So I know for me, I tend to use a slightly bigger needle. So if the pattern calls for a 3, I might use a 3.5. If it calls for a 5, I might use a 5.5. I just know that that little bit extra will compensate. It will force my stitches to be a little bit looser. Versus if you know you're a loose knitter, you would go down a needle size, and that would make your stitches tighten it up a little bit. Look, if you're making a scarf, it's not important, but if you're making a garment that you want to fit a human being and not be ridiculously large or ridiculously small, you do need to care about the tension. Sometimes also the pattern will specify a particular stitch for you to knit your tension swatch, because that will affect the tension as well. If you know, doing a combination of knits and purls or a cable. I know I cable very tightly as well. And even doing the 2-color knitting, like the Fair Isle here, your tension on that will be different to your tension over just 1-color knitting like this. So all of that affects. And it has other interesting knock-on challenges. So for example, making a blanket as a group project. You know, it's a common thing. People say, oh, I'm knitting squares for charity. If we all knit the same pattern, let's say, you know, 40 stitches, and we knit 40 rows, every single one of us will end up with a different size square because of our individual tension. And so some of that you fix by blocking. As I said, if you wash knitting, you can to some extent stretch it into the size you need and pin it out and let it dry, and it will usually stay in roughly that shape. So you can fix a little bit of sizing issues through blocking. Not great sizing issues, but it does make joining up different squares from different people quite difficult. So you don't often see big group knitting blanket projects because of that issue. It's a lot easier with sewing, with patchwork, because you can make sure they're exactly the same size. And it's harder with knitting because the exact same pattern, 2 knitters using the same woolen needles can come out very different sizes. And I've actually knitted this jumper, this is my second go. I started it a couple months back, and I knitted from the collar. I knitted sort of, you know, the first 3 or 4 motifs, and suddenly realized I was on a train that I'd stuffed it up. You know, the 3 rows between each of the motifs, I had misread the pattern, and sometimes they were 2 and sometimes they were 3. So then it was annoying. I mean, it wasn't super noticeable. I could have kept going, but I would have known, and it would have really bothered me. And the other thing I noticed was that the fabric, and I was using a bigger needle size. As I said, I often go up a needle size. It felt too loose. Like it actually felt a little like holey. You know, you could almost like see through it. You know, it just didn't feel the thickness that I wanted. And so I thought, you know what? Pull it apart. Let's just frog it, as we say in the knitting world. We call it frogging because you rip it, rip it, rip it. You know, you undo it. And so I frogged the whole thing. I frogged it back to nothing, and probably, you know, 8 hours of knitting at that point, started over again. I reckon it was fun to knit it the first time. It will be fun to knit it the second time. And so I went down a needle size when I started again, and I am much happier. The fabric this time I'm really enjoying, especially up here in the Fair Isle portion. Because with Fair Isle, like I said, you end up with double thickness as well. So you really want to make sure you get that tension right. And as I said, this pattern has you change needle sizes as you go. So I have gone up a needle size or 2 as I split for the armpits, and now as I'm going down the body, I will do one last size. And that's actually just making it a little bit bigger towards the hips. It's actually creating a little bit of a shape. Wow, this time is just flying by. I'm really pleased with my new setup. I spent some time today doing this little layout with the pattern details and the different cameras. So I hope you're enjoying it. I joked to my colleague Martin that it was going to be the most boring Twitch stream in the world, but I don't think it is. I think this is interesting. Hopefully you find it interesting too. Oh, back to the beginning again. I should probably count my rows, huh? I'm just going to do a few stitches past the stitch marker, and I'm going to spread this out. Cool. So I'm going to make sure they don't fall off the needle tips. Trust me, been there. That would be a disaster. And so now I'm going to try and count these stitches. And so if I turn it around, knitting stitches make little V's. That's how you almost kind of even see them there on the camera. I don't know if you're getting the resolution, but they make like a little V. And so each row is one of those little V's. So I'm just going to get one of my darning needles here, big plastic needle. And I'm going to count those V's. And I'm going to count from the armpit up. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And you can see I'm kind of hooking. See the V? It's got two legs, like I've hooked the needle through the two legs of the V. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 30, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 34, 35 rows. I'm not being super exact on this. I'm just knitting to the length that fits my body. And so I can try it on and see. I just know that the pattern said to knit, I think it was around, I need to check the pattern. I think it was around 50, 55 rows before I switched to a bigger needle. So that means I've still got another fair bit to go before I change needle size. So I will just keep going. I mean, if you were knitting a pattern that was very specific, like with doing increase, like when you knit a sleeve, for example, and you're doing increases every 10 rows or every 5 rows, then you do need to keep track of what row you're on. I do have an app on my phone, which is a knitting counter, which, you just tap a button when you finish a row and it will keep track of what row you're on, or whenever you get to the end of a round and get back to your starting point. They're also, you can buy them, just this sort of clicky plastic thing, ka-chunk. My friend Kelly calls them a ka-chunker. You ka-chunk, and that has a little dial that tells you how many rows you've done. It says some patterns, number of rows are important, others not so much. A scarf, you usually don't need to know for a scarf unless you're doing some complicated, 12-row repeat or something like that. I was thinking this would be a nice way to relax before I go to bed on Sunday night, but I have these giant lights shining in my face and I feel like I'm talking to people, so I'm actually kind of wide awake. So perhaps it was not the nice wind down activity that I thought it would be. But wow, with these 2 sessions, I've gotten a fair amount of knitting done today. Oh, it's great to do during meetings now that we're all at home on video well, those of us who are lucky to work from home and be on video conference, because you can, depending on the angle of your camera, you can knit during meetings and people will be none the wiser. It's fantastic. I knitted a whole jumper during lockdown earlier in the year, similar to this. Also we had an all day, like a 3-day all hands last week, or the week before. And that was great as well. If you're listening to sessions, this is a dropped a stitch. This is a fantastic activity if you're just listening to people talk. Unless you're doing a really complicated pattern or you drop stitches like I'm doing. What have I dropped it? 2 or 3? Just 2. Yeah, you can knit along during a meeting. reInvent, our big AWS event, which is all online this year, is kicking off this week. And my calendar is just chock a block of the sessions that I'm going to. And I will be probably knitting through most of them. I mean, I'll take some notes, but a pattern like this where it's just plain knitting is great. You don't want to do anything too complicated where you need, because I want my brain to be focused on the material and not on, which row am I on? Am I supposed to be knitting or purling? I actually feel like this is quite meditative. Like I listen to podcasts, or I'll have TV on in the background, nothing that I need to pay too much attention to. And I find my like listening skills are really heightened, you know? It's almost like using worry beads or reciting a mantra. You kind of get into a bit of a flow state mentally. And so I know plenty of women would swear by the fact that they concentrate better when they're knitting than if they're not. So yeah, I plan on knitting during a lot of reInvent this week, over the next 2 weeks. Still a couple of you on. I'm going to aim to go for an hour, so we still got a good 10 minutes left yet. Maybe I'll have a cheeky nightcap before I go to sleep. That'll help me wind down. I hope the audio's okay. I'm using the microphone in the headphones. I do have like a fancy microphone, but I'm actually using the microphone stand to hold my iPhone, which is the thing that you're seeing my hands with. So I've actually removed the microphone off it, and I've kind of rigged my iPhone on it to act as the second camera. So you don't get the fancy microphone. You only get the headphone microphone. But I figure it's more important for you to see my hands than to hear what I'm saying. And thank you to Martin Beebe for the idea. My colleague Martin, he's the one who gave me the idea of doing that. And it is working out great so far. I'm actually having fun with this. Was so sweet this week. A guy at work, he messaged me out of the blue, and he said, I know this is weird. He said, but during the all hands, as I mentioned, we did this all hands online. We had an icebreaker, and we had, tell 2 truths and a lie, or, that kind of thing. And he goes, am I remembering it correctly? Did you say you're a knitter? And I said, well, yes, I am. Why? What can I do for you? He said, well, my girlfriend wants to learn to knit, and so I thought for Christmas I would get her, a class gift certificate or some supplies. And I was like, oh my God, aren't you the sweetest thing in the world? So I spent some time helping him pick out some stuff from a local knitting shop. And he ended up getting her, he got her a set of the interchangeable circular, like really nice interchangeable circular needles. I was like, nice one, dude. And he picked out a couple different types of yarn so she could make a scarf. And I said, if you would like, because all the shops aren't doing classes right now, I said, if you want, you can tell her she's got a free complimentary lesson with me. And he was like, really? You do that? I'm like, yeah, I don't have any knitting friends here in Munich yet. I mean, look at me. I'm talking to my computer and to the 3 people who are still sitting here after an hour. So I might, he was so excited to like print up a little thing and tell her that she was going to have a lesson with an expert. So looking forward to that. Maybe next week, I don't know if I'll still be working on this or if I'll switch it up to something else. I do have a couple whips, as we say in the knitting world, WIP, work in progress. Every knitter, I think it would have to be a very disciplined knitter to not have any but one whip. Most of us normally have several whips sitting in various states of hibernation. I have 3 or 4 over there. I actually went through when we were packing up the house in Australia, and some of the stuff that I just knew I was never going to get to, I frogged. But there's a cardigan that I was knitting, which is an all over Fair Isle. So the 2 colors, except using lots of colors, like 6 or 8 different colors, all over the whole body. I have most of the body of the cardigan knitted, and I did this several years ago, and it's really expensive, really nice wool. And I stopped because I suspect it's not going to fit me. And so I'm going to have to frog it. I'm going to have to frog it and knit something else with it. I don't want to. I put so much work into it, but that's just ridiculous, right? It's not going to fit me. I mean, I could knit it and give it to some. I'm not going to knit it and give it to one of you. I want it's for me. I really like the design. Problem is the wool, I think, is discontinued, so I'm not sure I can get more to try knitting a bigger size. So I'm actually thinking I'll frog it, but I might try and turn it into a vest. So if I pull it apart, frog it, re-knit the body, but knit it at a bigger size, but leave off the sleeves. Instead, turn it into a sleeveless Farrell vest. You know, it's very, very traditional style, very Edward VIII. You know, Prince of Wales. He popularized Farrell styles quite a bit back in the 30s. Yeah, I might turn it into a vest. So maybe I'll work on that. I've also got a child's cardigan. I started knitting for, someone's question. Yes. Which yarn is it? Glad you asked. The details on the project I'm knitting are in the box on the screen, the red box. This is a Lana Grossa Cool Wool Fine, it's called, which is a pure extra fine merino. I'm guessing based on the wool mark that it's actually Australian merino. I think we're pretty much the only place that do merino. But it is made in Italy, so spun and dyed presumably in Italy. It is so soft. It is so soft, like it's not scratchy in the slightest, which is why I picked it. It's really nice, and nice deep colors they had as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to wearing it if I can actually finish it. But that's the wool. And it's quite thin. As I said, the needle size 2.5 to 3, which would put it at, I guess, a fingering weight, we would say, a 4-ply in Australia. You know, that's normally the thickness you would knit like baby garments out of, or very fine garments, socks. You know, you can knit thicker things, but thicker wool and bigger needles goes faster. But I find, well, look, now I'm in Munich. I'm wearing my thick jumper like this. I can wear some of the thicker knitted things that in Sydney, in Australia, just didn't really make a lot of sense. Never got cold enough to really justify wearing very thick wool. That's what I thought. I'll start doing thinner pieces for myself. You can layer a bit more then. But yeah, I think it's considered a fingering. It might be a sport weight technically, which is more like what we'd call a 5-ply in Australia. But again, the designations for wool thickness are again, there's no standard. They vary from country to country. You know, what you call an 8-ply in Australia we use ply, which technically should refer to how many strands are twisted together, but we instead use it in Australia. We've bastardized it to use thickness. So an 8-ply thickness in Australia is called like a double knitting in the UK, and in the US usually goes by, I think, a light worsted. So yeah, there's different names for the different thicknesses, but I think this is a fingering, a 4-ply thickness or a baby thickness. Oh, I'm going to need to stretch after this. I have a friend, Allison, who does yoga. She's a yoga teacher, and she winces when she sees me knit because I hunch. I end up sort of, it's supposed to be a relaxing hobby and not the way I do it, apparently. So we actually, my Knitters Guild back in Sydney, the inner city group, we actually start every meeting with 5 minutes of seated yoga, you know, so we'll stretch our arms, we'll stretch our neck, do the thing where you hunch the shoulders up and relax them. So yeah, if you're sitting for any length of time in knitting, especially beginners, because beginners are also really nervous and they tend to, really hunch up. Stop every now and then and stand up, stretch, take a break, or you will do yourself an injury. I have actually, like if I'm sick or if it's a day where I'm just spending the whole day knitting, doesn't happen that often, but on the few occasions, I will end up sore at the end of it. My shoulders will be sore from tension. You don't want to do that in a hobby that's meant to be relaxing. All right, we are at an hour, folks, so I'm just going to get to the end of this round, and then I'm going to call it a night. It's always a good idea if you are knitting back and forth, flat knitting, to not stop in the middle of a row, because you will kind of stretch out the stitch you're on when you stop. And it can make a little bit of a looser stitch, so it's always good to get to finish a row. And so, it doesn't matter as much given that I'm knitting in the round, but I will, because the start of my row is in the middle of the armpit, I will make sure that that's where I stop for the night. So if it is going to have any effect on the knitting, it's in a place that isn't, smack dab in the middle of the chest or something like that. Yeah, when you're knitting in the round, you will often, the pattern will take care to make sure that the start of the round, I think traditionally the start of the round is normally the back of the left shoulder. That seam there is usually where you start, because if you are knitting a design with stripes or color work, you actually do get a bit of a jog there, because we are knitting in a spiral. Remember, we're going around and around in like a spiral staircase. And so when you come around with one color and then you go to another color, they actually don't line up perfectly. There's a bit of a jog in the, so you want to you don't want to put that on the front where people will see it. So you tend to put it on the back. And said in my case, I've actually chosen to put it in the armpit. Won't be very noticeable. And we're almost at the end. Note to self, bring a glass of water when you do this, or wine, because I've been parched, been talking a little bit more than I expected. Any last questions from the peanut gallery here before I call it a night? It's very nice to have you have joined me. This has been fun. And I believe, tell Twitch to save the recording for 2 weeks. So it will be available afterwards. So if you want to go back and see the beginning, or if you want to send it to someone else, it will be available on my channel for the next 2 weeks. Okay, I'm getting back to the end of the row. So I will not finish right at the marker, because if I knit the last stitch, the marker will fall off. So I'll just stop 1 stitch before the marker. I'll kind of pull my needles out a bit so it's not going to fall off. And I will leave it right there. So as you can see, I've got several inches down from the end of the motif where I split for the armholes. I think it's about time I do another fit check. So I'm going to have to try it on. And because this 60 centimeter needle, there's no actual way that I'm going to get that around my torso. Haha, I wish. That means I'm going to have to thread it onto some scrap wool. So I'm going to get my darning needle and a length of scrap wool, and I'm actually going to thread every one of these 400 stitches onto that scrap wool, and then I'll be able to try it on and see if the sizing is working out. And then I'm going to put it back on the needle before I start knitting again. So thanks. Oh, looks great. Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you like it. Yes, Susan Crawford design, Lanatus. Her book is called Evolution. I just saw her tweet or she sent out an email that the book has been physically printed. Really great designs. There's a couple in there. There's another cardigan that I really like with some sort of intarsia flowers around the top, which don't normally wear floral motif, but it's really pretty. So check it out, and hopefully I will see you next week, and we'll do some more knitting on Sunday. So thanks for joining me, and have a lovely week.